Hey everyone, it's Horror Free for All, and I hope you're doing well today. I'm joined with my good friend Micah, who also goes by the name of the Ultimate Goosebumps Man. How are you doing tonight, Micah?
I'm doing great. Just got done with my finals, so now next couple days are just gonna be packing, and then I'm heading back home for the summer.
Nice. And I think this is a good thing to start off with after finals because you're such a big Nightmare on Elm Street fan, and we've been trying to do this, but we finally have the time to do it. Where we're going to sit down and share our rankings of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And Micah, since you're a massive fan, I want you to just describe how you feel about the franchise and why do you love it so much.
Well, main reasons I love this, it's the first horror franchise I've ever gotten into. Nightmare on Elm Street's the first like hardcore horror movie that I watched. So it's always had a special place in my heart for that. I love the idea of Freddy Krueger. He's easily the scariest slasher icon to me personally, just because of just the idea of him being able to kill you in your dreams. Because no matter what you do, you can stay awake as long as you want. You're gonna die from sleep, lack of sleep, or you can go to sleep and he'll kill you in your dreams. So it's a lose-lose situation unless you know how to fight back, like some of these characters do. And that concept is just terrifying to me because, again, as I said, either way, you're gonna die no matter what you try to do to prevent it. And Freddy Krueger is just such an awesome and iconic horror villain. You know, he's got probably the coolest horror weapon of all time with the finger knife glove. And just Wes Craven and everyone who went into making Freddy who he is just they did masterful jobs with him, despite the way they took him in the later half of the original six. I still love him for what he is, and Robert Englund just always is going to be probably my favorite horror actor. He just does such a good job putting such emotion into Freddy, the same way like Brad Dourif does with Chucky. You just gotta love it for that.
Yeah, and one thing I've always loved about A Nightmare on Elm Street, it's very similar to my love of Final Destination, and that is the versatility of the franchise. If there's any slasher out there that deserved a franchise, I'm not gonna lie. As a massive Halloween fan, I don't think Halloween deserved one. Maybe if they went the anthology route, Friday the 13th, what are we doing? Even Child's Play, what are we doing? But A Nightmare on Elm Street, you have versatility with Freddy Krueger. Not only are you not held to the realms of reality with the character, but literally in every single movie, every death is an event. There's a whole event. There's its own setup and build up, own suspense and terror in each scene that he kills somebody, and that's what makes the franchise, I think, that extra level when we're talking about slashers. And I totally get why people say Nightmare on Elm Street is 100% the best overall slasher franchise. And I can say I've seen all the movies, all the way from the first one to the remake. I get it. I get it. It's like I said, it's like Final Destination, where each movie you kind of know what to expect. Freddy's going to put some kids in some nightmares. He's going to kill them in a nightmare sequence. But that's the fun of it. The fun is the formula, and that's what makes it so much fun. And Robert England, he's a treasure. He's an American treasure of cinema. He's one of those select few people. He's maybe like a Treat Williams to me, or he's like maybe like a Morton Downey Jr. or some other folks of yesteryear that were just big names in horror that you knew what you were watching was instant classic material. And that all stems back to the original movie, the house that Freddy built, New Line Cinema, first movie they ever made was A Nightmare on Elm Street, and look what that got that studio. They went on to make other big successes in the 90s. They got bought out by Warner Brothers, but hey, they're still making movies today. And we might be getting a new Freddy movie sooner than later. And I think we mentioned this on a previous recording that A Nightmare on Elm Street was like super popular, not only with like adults and teens, but kids. There was a lot of merchandise and marketing to kids back in the 80s. There was toys. There were so many different things you can get Freddy on. And I do feel like in this ranking, we're probably going to discuss this in some fashion. That in the early days of the franchise, it kind of knew what it was, but as time went on, it got more cartoonish. It got more flanderized, and that's kind of maybe the main reason why the franchise ended when it did. Everything has its course. I've watched the Never Sleep Again documentary. I don't know if you've watched that before, but
Mhm.
I love that documentary. It's one of my favorite horror documentaries ever made. And just to hear everything and all the hindsight the creators had making those movies, that does kind of paint a picture that if they can go back and do some of this stuff again, they would have definitely made it more tighter and had better planning going into some of these movies than they did. Which is
Mhm.
unfortunate, but hey, we still got a solid franchise here. I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street, you have so many commendable movies, and it's kind of hard placing these films from worst to best. But to me, I do have like a definitive bottom three, and I think we've already kind of touched on this. Like we have like this a similar bottom three, and I'm gonna pass it over to you because I know you love this franchise so much. What would you put as the worst Nightmare on Elm Street movie?
Well, this is going to be very controversial among a lot of people watching because most people consider this in the top three best Nightmare movies. But mine is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I've never been a huge fan of this movie. In my opinion, it's just boring, is the best way to describe it. There's not a lot of kills, not a lot of Freddy, and the Freddy you do get isn't even Freddy. It's a demon masquerading as Freddy in the real world. You got some arguably good performances from Henry Langenkamp and not even Wes Craven, but John Saxon and some of them still bring their A game to this movie. And there are a lot of fun little callbacks and Easter eggs to the first movie, and even some cameos from cast members like Tuesday Night and can't remember the actor's name, but the guy who played Rod in the first movie. Um, but it's just kind of, despite the fact that it is kind of a fun homage to the Nightmare franchise, it just doesn't have a lot going for it. Miko Hughes is not very good, which, like, to be fair, he was like really little in this movie, so you gotta at least give him some kind of benefit of the doubt there. But another reason I think this fails is specifically because it went too long. They added like 30 more minutes on than any of the other Nightmare movies, and that just is not needed. It just makes the plot drag, and it's just not really an entertaining Freddy movie for me.
Yeah, I think this movie it has some ideas going for it. Like if we're talking about meta movies and like in horror, often than not, a lot of people love to compare this to Scream because I think Scream, that original movie, is like the penultimate meta commentary horror movie. This movie, I think it was made for the fans, and it's made talking about the fans and how that creates this larger than life persona, and that's literally the metaphor of the demon in the movie. And I think that's what Wes Craven realized when he created that movie, that man, this is going to be the film that defines my career, and that's why he kind of walked away from it because he didn't want to do a franchise. To be fair, John Carpenter did the same thing in Halloween 1 and 2. He didn't want to make Michael his one trick pony. He didn't want the original creators of Friday. They did like the first two, then they walked off. They said, take it and do what you want. They didn't want that to be their own legacy. So I can see why. I can see why Wes Craven put off a lot. And I think he worked on three, but when he came back to this movie, he wanted to do something different to send off the franchise, especially because of the backlash people had over Part Six. Which, if we're talking knee jerk reactions, at least of the time, I can get why you might have some nostalgia with this movie. But as somebody who was, I think, born after this movie came out, look, this movie is a slog, y'all. I mean, I love Heather Langenkamp in the movie. I think Robert Englund does some of his best performance work in this, at least in terms of characters. I think the demon character was pretty creepy. I do like him playing himself in the role. I think that kind of adds some depth to what went on behind the scenes. I think there is some layers of truth there, and I think the Never Sleep Again documentary kind of pointed that out. And also, the fact that Johnny Depp wasn't even asked to be in this movie, but he's gone on record saying he would have done it if he was asked. Come on, y'all.
Mm.
Y'all didn't think to ask him. Like seeing what is his name, Bob Shay, in like a meta thing that was kind of cool. But you get two kills in this movie, y'all. Two kills in a slasher franchise movie. right? It's 30 minutes long, longer than the rest of them, and it clearly shows it's nothing but character drama and just build up and build up and build up and build up, and it takes forever to get to the climax, which is easily the best part of the whole movie. That's like the only thing. Whenever I think about this movie, or whenever I want to watch it, I'll watch like the first 15 minutes, and then I'll skip through it, and I'll go to the final 15 minutes. I That's all you need to see of this movie, in my opinion. I have to agree here. It's just probably the most boring of the franchise. And to all the Scream fanboys saying that this is the precursor to Scream, sure, maybe this movie walks so Scream could run, but it's not that good. It's not
Mm,
that good.
yeah. And like the fact that they didn't ask Johnny Depp to be in this one, but they gave him a cameo in Freddy's Dead.
I know, right? Like, he I don't think he was in the Never Sleep Again documentary. Um,
Mm-mm.
like they didn't ask him to come on, but when I think it was Bob Shea, he learned after the fact when Johnny Depp was doing an interview, and he was asked about the movie. He's like, I wish they would have asked me. I would have come back on and played myself. Blah blah blah, and maybe we could have had Johnny Depp as like a main character in the movie. That probably could have saved it a little bit, in my opinion. But
Yeah. Hmm.
hindsight's 2020. um. So yeah, great pick for your worst. I totally get why um it's very close, but it's not quite there to be my worst. My worst is actually part five, Dream Child.
Mm.
Dream Child to me, minus a few kills in the movie, like the iconic. If we're talking about the uncut kills, I actually went and watched all the uncut footage before we recorded this. Y'all, if there's any movie in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise that got screwed over or fucked over hard by the MPAA, it's this fucking movie. And the uncut version is only on, I think, VHS. I don't even think they put it on 4K yet. So that that VHS is expensive as hell for diehard Elm Street fans, and I get why. Because these kills, if you watch the uncut motorcycle kill, that has to be the most brutal death in all of Nightmare on Elm Street, bar
Hmm.
none. That was absolutely awesome. The extra stuff in the food death, where the girl's getting her
Yep.
food cut out of her stomach, that is great too.
Hmm.
Now there are some ones that might have some good technical things, like the comic book one, how it was filmed. I think you brought this up to me in the past, but the execution is cartoonish. And when we're looking into the plot, this is where the franchise started to kind of ruin the mystique of Freddy Krueger, or go into irreconcilable damage. Because not only do they go a little too deep in Freddy's lore in this movie, I think they kind of ruin his character for me in this original timeline, because they make Freddy the product of a raped nun. Okay, and I don't like using that term, but that's literally what happened. She was like put into an insane asylum, and she pretty much got like done up dirty like that. And she ended up giving birth to Freddy, who is the spawn of Satan, essentially. And we see a younger version of Freddy, which is fine and all, but the whole concept of this is that you have a pregnant character where Freddy's trying to take over the mind of an embryo or a baby. Um, what? And that's just no. Like that's something I did not want to see this franchise go down. Even like the first time when I was actually watching all these movies in succession, that I can remember like actually what I was watching and taking in the story. When I got to part five, I was like, yeah, no, this is easily the least revisitable one in my opinion. And I know that's kind of a hot take for all those diehard fans that think that six is worse, but I think five is worse. And I know six has some weird things about it, but yeah, this is not good.
Yeah, I would agree there. It's a couple of spots down from yours, but I agree. Five is definitely like of the original six movies, five is definitely the weakest. As you said, there's some awesome stuff in there, especially the uncut kills. But yeah, they definitely went a little too far into the cartoonishness with Freddy in this movie. Like this is they go a little bit too farther in it with Freddy's Dead, but I think this is Freddy's just annoying in part 5 more than anything. And like I mean, like the whole storyline of Freddy's conception and birth and stuff was brought up in part 3. That was already kind of established, but I feel like they went a little too far into it in part 5.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, if you're reading a book, right? Sometimes you want to be shown something with the writing than being told, because that helps paint a bigger picture in your mind of like origin and backstory and lore and all that. But in a film, especially a franchise, with when we're dealing with a horror icon that kind of thrives on the unknown mysticisms of dreams, when you give him a root in reality origin like that, and you go farther than beyond how he died, right? The first movie kind of hints that, oh, these parents got together and killed him, okay. And then later on in the franchise we start to get into how he was born and why he became what he did. And then in part 6 it goes way over the loony bin, saying that he had a daughter and all that, and all these demon slugs that look like sperm cells possessed him. Look, I mean, this is where the franchise started to hop off the wagon. Okay, um, and like you said, it's cartoony. Freddy is annoying. This is like the only time in the Friday, not Friday, the Nightmare franchise, where when I'm watching Robert Englund trying to deliver jokes, I'm kind of cringing a little bit. I'm not like laughing that much with it. I'm like, you can tell that the writers are trying to be edgy funny, and I do feel like that's a miscalculation. And honestly, I feel like a lot of this direction choice was them trying to be edgy because the MPAA wasn't allowing them to be edgy in the kills of the
Mhm.
time. We saw this in Friday the 13th franchise, where they had to pivot their story concepts to appease the MPAA and to make it more outlandish for fans to be like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like we saw this in after Friday Part 5. In Part 6, they made Jason Frankenstein. In Part 7, they had him fight a Carrie knockoff. In 8, they're going to take him to Manhattan and have him kill New York. Okay, it's all gimmicks, right? This is where Nightmare on Elm Street became like a gimmick. It's a cartoon gimmick. It's the Freddy show. This is where it started to peak in popularity. You had Freddy's Nightmares on television. You had all this merchandise out. Um, and it kind of killed it. It kind of killed it until part 6 too, and then part 6 put the nail in the coffin. But I think this is the movie. They brought it up in the documentary that after this one, they kind of wanted it to stop because they realized they kind of wrote themselves into a huge wall
Yeah.
with this movie.
And like from
So
what I
yeah,
heard, like this is also the most rushed production. Like it went from concept to script to screen in like a really short period of time.
I know. I think Bob Shea said that this is the one that he's least proud of too. So
Mhm.
yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. Um, yeah, this is probably one of those scripts that never should have happened. It's kind of like Halloween 5, in my opinion. Very
Mhm.
rushed. They're trying to capitalize on the success of 4 to try to make sure that they're not going to lose certain people to get on board, and you end up with a train wreck more
Yeah.
often than not. All right, so those are our worst, and let's move on. What's your next to last?
My next to last would be the remake from 2010. Now, Platinum Dunes, the company that made this, run by Michael Bay, they were on a kick in the late 2000s of making horror remakes. You know, they had a really big success in 2003 with the Texas Chainsaw remake, which I've not seen. I haven't really seen any of the Texas Chainsaw movies, but I've heard that one's a pretty solid remake. Then in 2009, they did the Friday the 13th remake, which I've heard very opposing sides on. Some people love it, some people hate it. I feel like this is the one Platinum Dunes remake that's pretty much cohesively agreed on to be a bad movie. And there's a lot of flaws with it. The main thing is just the fact that they changed Freddy's backstory and make him a pedophile. That just like ruins everything for him. Because the whole fun of this franchise is you want to root for Freddy. That's the fun of this. As messed up as that is, we come to these slasher franchise to watch the killer and root for the killer. You can't do that when your killer is a pedophile. And like just the way they shot for shot, so many scenes in the original with really crappy CGI. And while I like what Jackie Earle Haley did with Freddy, I think he is a very intimidating and scary Freddy. Again, the backstory kills it. They have this whole mystery building up about, was Freddy actually innocent, and is he killing us as revenge for being wrongly accused and killed out of a misconception that maybe these kids were making up? Yep, nope, they're out the window. He was actually a pedophile, and like they didn't, then why include the mystery if you're just going to confirm it anyway? And the main sin for me is Rooney Mara as Nancy. She sleepwalks, no pun intended, through this entire movie, has no passion. And it's very clear from behind the scenes that she did not want to do this movie. She just did it for the money. And it shows in her performance. She is just so bland, especially when comparing her to Heather Langenkamp's Nancy from the original. Like, there's no comparison which one is superior. So that's a lot of the reasoning why I hate this. There are some good moments. Again, Jackie Earle Haley's Freddy is pretty good. There are some cool elements with the micro naps idea, especially that scene in the supermarket where Nancy's kind of flashing in and out of the dream and reality, where the aisle is turning into the boiler room and stuff. That scene was cool. But everything else, and also the opening scene in the diner was pretty cool with Dean like slitting his own throat. I thought that was pretty epic. Other than that, yeah, not a fan of this one.
Yeah, my next to last is actually the remake as well. Platinum Dunes to me was a one hit wonder, and then Friday the 13th remake. You know, it's kind of on my top five in the Friday the 13th franchise by default because I'm not huge on that franchise whatsoever. But I will say one thing I liked about the remake of Friday the 13th was that they combined the first four movies, which didn't have much plot, and they combined the best elements of those and they try to work that into the remake. With A Nightmare on Elm Street, they just stuck with that first movie. And I think that was their biggest mistake. They should have at least tried to incorporate one and three and try to make
Mhm.
both into the remake and make kind of like and bridge the gap of a true two in there as well. They could have taken a lot of liberties with one, had some characters carry over to a two scenario where you get these new characters kind of coming in, or maybe some other side characters that we didn't get to see or explore that well, and then have more part three elements in there. And I think that would have been fun. You didn't need to go down into the straight up remake route of the first movie and then immediately off the get go start tampering with the origins of Freddy Krueger, right? I
Mhm.
get trying to modernize slashers or horror movies sometimes can be kind of a daunting task as a creator. I've seen the creators of this movie come on before and like talk with people on like podcasts, and they say that they thought at the time that this would have been like an edgier angle that was kind of synonymous with those late 2000s slasher movies. These movies coming out were like no holds bar edgy stuff, right?
Mhm.
And they thought this was going to kind of propel them a little bit and make them stand out a little bit. But it backfired. Again, because they didn't learn the mistakes of part five, part six, and all the other mistakes that they made in the franchise by messing with the mystique of Freddy Krueger. That's the biggest sin this movie has, next to its other blemishes that are obvious. You already brought up Rooney Mara. Her playing Heather Langenkamp was the biggest miscast of this movie. They should have had Katie Cassidy,
Mhm.
another character in the movie, actually play her because she was probably the best actress in this whole movie, bar none. And it's kind of sad to see her wasted off like that, but it is what it is. The CGI, them doing the disgrace that the production crew did on that original movie is actually kind of saddening. Like the iconic Freddy coming through the wall, all of that is CGI. Pretty much all the transitions between reality and dream is CGI. And even though it's kind of a cool element that I think was missing in that original movie, that's kind of cool. Like you could be just in the reality realm, and then you can just switch on the dream. That's really cool. Um, and there are some things done to some deaths in this movie from the original that I kind of prefer. Like there are some aspects of the prison death that I like a
Mhm.
little more. Or like you said, the throat slitting was pretty good. And I do think that Jackie Earle Haley plays a good Freddy. Like I don't think he's the problem. I think he was a great fill-in for Robert England, and I'm not going to say anything else. You know, and I've seen some people say, I forget the guy's name, the guy that was in Dylan's New Nightmare. I mean, that guy, he could play a good Freddy too. But I'm telling you,
Mhm.
Jackie Earl Haley needs to get his roses for his performance. I'm not basing that on the source material though. That the material that he was given, I can live without this. I'd rather watch the original over this. This kind of spits in the face of that. It doesn't really offer anything new to the story because it's so shot for shot, other than the added element that he was a pedophile, and we don't need that. So that's why it's here.
Mhm. And like I will say, when you're talking about the Friday the 13th remake, though, you gotta admit, Derek Mears as Jason is fucking terrifying in that
Oh
movie.
yeah,
Like,
oh yeah, and he can like run at you like Part Three Jason, and that's kind of makes him intimidating to me. A
mhm.
Jason that's willing to chase you down, that's more intimidating than some hulking brute just taking his time to come after you. Like even like Part Four Jason had that element to him where he was willing to chase you down. But yeah,
Yeah, and like that Jason is brutal as well. Like some of those deaths, like the sleeping bag kill where he has like her over the fire, like
yeah,
that'd be torturous.
that opening scene of that remake has to be some of the best moments of the whole Friday franchise. Like that first
Mhm,
15 minutes. It's definitely one of the more sleazier films too, and I think that's why it has a lot
mhm,
of fans too in the franchise because it's so overly sleazy. I'm not saying that would have benefited this movie because the first Nightmare on Elm Street was not a sleazy movie. So I can kind of see why they didn't go that route here, but if they wanted to be edgier, they could have at least put a new spin on it with the characters. Maybe
mhm.
they could have been, uh, less generic than the first movie. They could have done more character stuff, or maybe made them easily like deplorable people themselves to make Freddy kind of look better. I don't know. They could have done something different with that, but they didn't do that. They
Yeah,
just
yeah. Or like another interesting idea that I think I brought up to you in the past is have a little plot twist that no one would expect. Have Nancy die, and then have the Chris, like Katie Cassidy's character, who's supposed to be kind of like Tina from the first film, have her be the one to carry on the movie. Like that would have been a great subversion of expectations for audiences.
Yeah, and that reminds me. I think we brought this up in the past too. Um, the My Bloody Valentine remake, they subverted expectations with the killers and the survivors in the remake because everybody going into it, they knew the name of the killer and whatever in the original movie, and in that remake they inverted it and it made it more surprising to see at the end, which I thought was really cool. But yeah, I definitely think that would have helped it too. But as its own movie in the franchise, it just doesn't stand out. And if it does, it's for the wrong reasons. So that's why I have it here, and
Yeah.
that's why you have it here too, I think. But let's move on to our next pick, third to last. What's your third to last?
So my third to last is Dream Child. Won't go too deeply into this because you've already kind of discussed your side of things, and I agree with a lot of the things you said. So I feel like I don't really need to go super in depth with it. But yeah, it's just a weird movie. Like the whole idea of Freddy trying to get into the dreams of an unborn child and kill through that, and like almost make himself reborn through this child is such a weird idea. And especially this must be the wildest and most dumb third act in like Death of Freddy outside of Freddy's Dead. Like just the way that like Jacob has like that really weird thing where he turns into like a mini Freddy and then spits a giant tongue onto his back. And then like the heads of the victims like pull out of him until they pull the baby stuff out of Freddy. Like that was so weird and so like of all the things you could have done with the Freddy's death in this movie, that's what you go with. And like the kid who plays Jacob, like no offense to him, but he's not very good. And like he's been in his mother stuff. He was the kid who Alan Grant scared at the beginning of Jurassic Park, and he's been in a few other things, but he's not good in this movie. You know, I think Lisa Wilcox is still very good as Alice. I like Alice as a final girl, and I think Lisa Wilcox at least does a somewhat good job with it. You know, I still like Dan. It's a shame they kill him off right at the beginning of the movie because him and Alice are easily the two best characters, and you literally lose Dan in the first like half an hour. And that, like, even though it's an awesome death, it sucks because, like, then you leave with all these very stock, generic, bland characters who, like, the horror channel Dead Meat actually made a joke about this in his kill count for this movie, that he swears the characters in this movie just had their traits picked out of a hat because they're so generic and so, like, randomly intertwined, and, like, it's just not very interesting overall. And, like, as you said, Freddy is a complete cartoon, and while he is that way in part 6, it just doesn't work in this movie. At least with part 6, he makes it fun and makes it kind of entertainingly cheesy. In this, it's just kind of a really dumb and bland comedic take of him, and it just feels too forced. Especially in, like, that scene, like, when he's killing before the motorcycle scene, and when he's in the car with Dan, and, like, all the stuff he does, all the crappy one-liners he makes, and, like, pouring wine onto his arm and ripping it off and turning it into a seatbelt and stuff, and it's just like, why? It just doesn't make sense to me. And of course, the whole comic book scene almost feels like a rated R version of Goosebumps Attack of the Mutants episode with how goofy and cheesy it is. And, like, while there's, again, some cool technical aspects with it, the scene overall is just bad. And everything else you pretty much covered. So I've said my piece.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, the over the top finale and like the pouring the wine to rip off his arm. I think this was like them trying to compensate for the MPAA. I think that all
Yep.
ties together with this movie. Like them trying to be over the top and more comedic because they can't be graphic anymore, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think we pretty much covered that movie. And
Yep.
my third to last is actually Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and I think we've already covered that one pretty much in depth. I don't really have much else to add on it personally. I think we've already said everything we need to say about that one too. So we pretty
Yeah.
much have the same bottom three, which I think is fun. Is invert the bottom and the third from the bottom.
Yep.
But let's move on. Let's go to our fourth from the bottom. I guess we're getting close to the middle. What's your next one?
So my next one is Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. A lot of people say this is the worst movie of the franchise, and I can understand people's opinions on it because they take Freddy in such a ridiculous and, like, overly cartoony. Like, this is basically Freddy Krueger turned into a Looney Tunes cartoon, basically. And I get why people don't like that because it ruins Freddy completely from how he was in the original movies and makes him not scary in the slightest bit. They're really bad characters. There's that stupid fucking video game kill that just, like, it's, in my opinion, it's worse than the comic book kill just because of all the cartoony sound effects and, like, all the scenes of, like, Spencer in the real world, like, just bouncing up into the ceiling and, like, running around in these really cartoony effects and stuff. And it's just, why? And then, of course, the fucking Power Glove reference. Just, like, that whole scene is, like, bottom 5 worst scenes in the whole Nightmare franchise. But I will say, I still have some fun with this movie, especially with the hearing aid kill with Carlos, because it combines all the best aspects of Freddy from the original movies. The way he psychologically tortures people, the way he uses their weaknesses against them. And, this kill is, like, drawn out too. It's not like a quick little sequence. He tortures this kid by like sticking that giant cotton swab through the brain, which I don't know how that didn't kill him already. That would easily would have just killed him. But then you have that multi-layer kill of the giving him the super-powered hearing aid that just amplifies everything to, like, 1,000th degree, where, like, a water drop feels like a beating drum, or just a falling pin sounds like a grenade being dropped. Like, that stuff is kind of, while it's cartoony, I find it fun, especially when he brings out the chalkboard. Because, like, when you think about how, like, nails or knives on a chalkboard sound normally, imagine what Carlos is hearing right now. And, like, that just makes you squirm to think about how bad that must be. And, of course, it ends with a head explosion. Like, you can't beat that. That's a pretty awesome practical effect, too. And, there's, again, the way they change Freddy's lore is just dumb in this movie, So he'll have him having a daughter thing and having that whole dream demon stuff. And then one of the other big sins is the whole 3D gimmick. While it may have worked in the theaters, when you're watching it on a home release, you don't get that 3D gimmick. So you have a bunch, it's like a Friday the 13th part 3 scenario where you have a bunch of dumb shit flying in your face with like no reason to do it. And it just looks really dumb when you're watching it without the 3D glasses. And that's kind of my reasonings behind this movie. Why it's a mess, but it's a fun mess.
No, when I was thinking about like, is there a so bad it's good, or could be considered that in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise? I wouldn't say six or Freddy's Dead, as it's more affectionately known as, is a so bad it's good, but it's so bad I kind of see the charm in it. Like it's a funny kind of bad for me. You know, I was not around when this movie came out. I was not a big Freddy guy when I first watched this movie. So, you know, going into it, you know, after seeing it a couple amount of times and getting to hear what the creators said behind the scenes and how the director took a lot of inspiration from Looney Tunes cartoons, because that's the direction they wanted to go, and like she was just going with the direction, right? That's whatever. You know, I can totally see why they had to make a movie because the studio told them to make a certain type of movie, right? This was the early '90s. You know, slashers still kind of were in that weird limbo where you had these franchises out, but they're starting to go straight to video, right? And Nightmare on Elm Street is kind of like that last hurrah before, you know, Jason Goes to Hell, then, you know, Halloween Part 6, and then Scream hits the reset button. So, you know, this movie is very instrumental in slasher history for it being so bad. Because, you know, this is the penultimate example of cartoon Freddy, and like the whole mismanagement in that back half, where I can totally see why you hate this movie if you hate Freddy and how he's depicted in the movie. Yes, he's over the top and cartoonish. Yes, his makeup looks absolutely cheap. It looks the easily the worst Freddy makeup of the whole franchise is in this movie. It looks bad. The kill sequences are cartoonish. Minus, like I said, like you said, the hearing aid kill is probably the most classic Freddy kill of the whole movie. Even more classic Freddy than some of the Part Five stuff. Maybe minus the feeding scene, which is more Part Four kind of, and then you had the motorcycle kill, which is definitely like Dream Warrior stuff. Um,
Mhm.
you have some good things in this film. But the final act to me is where it kind of like it takes a lot to hold back frustration with that final act, especially with that sequence where you see the demon slugs flying around. And in the theatrical version, they told you to put on your 3D glasses for this, and all you see is Robert England screaming into the camera, and you see you see his head coming out of his mouth like numerous times. It is some of the worst 3D effects I have ever seen in my life, ever. And this is like from 1991, where it was more primitive. Good God Almighty! What a way to send out Freddy. And I haven't even gotten to the story stuff. You like with him having a daughter is bullshit to me. I mean, I kind of like
Mhm.
the daughter in the story. I thought that was probably one of the better parts about it. Honestly, getting to see her arc with it. And I guess if you're going to kill off Freddy, him having his bloodline to kill him off, I guess, is not that bad of an idea. But this shit is way last minute. This is kind of like a Halloween Inn scenario with Corey Cunningham, right? Where was this shit in the other movies?
Mhm.
You know, it would have made more sense if that stuff was put back in the older ones. We could have had some breadcrumbs to it. Um, but yeah, this is just, you know, it's here by default for me. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
All right, I guess we'll move on to the next one. All right, so what's your next one, Micah?
So my next one is Freddy versus Jason. This is a fun movie. It's a dumb movie, but it's a fun movie. And sometimes that's all you need with the movie. You just need a good turn off your brain and have fun movie. And this is the definition of that. There's just, these two slasher icons coming together to fight. Something that was already teased at the end of Jason Goes to Hell when Freddy's glove comes up and takes Jason's mask down underground. And they were waiting for like how many years? I don't remember when Jason Goes to Hell came out, but because this came out in 2003, so the year I was born actually. Um, but this movie is just a blast. There's a lot of messy stuff with the main characters. Like the cast is not very likable. Most of the cast is very Friday the 13th coded with how they're acting. But then there's also characters like uh what's his name? The guy who's played by Brendan Fletcher. I can't remember the character's name, but Mark, that's what his
Mark,
name is.
yeah.
But and he is probably the most Nightmare on Elm Street centered character of that group. And he's a fun character. I like him a lot. And there's a lot of really fun elements. All the fight scenes between Freddy and Jason are just a blast. They're just pure campy, gory fun, especially that final fight of them on the dock and on the construction field. There's just a lot of fun to be had with this movie. My main gripe is that Freddy gets one kill. They get Jason. So pretty much the bulk of the kills in the movie, they get him that awesome like cornfields rave massacre scene where he's just butchering people left and right. And they literally have him stealing kills from Freddy, like with Gib when Freddy has her trapped in the boiler room and Jason stabs her in the back in the real world and pulls her out. And Freddy gets one kill with Mark, and I will give that kill is pretty good. The way Freddy psychologically fucks with Mark in that scene, like making him see his brother who offed himself, and then like having mocking him with that, then having these like blood tendril things like stab into his feet, burns his back, slashes his face, and like it's just like another one of those really brutal, psychologically tormenting Freddy kills, which is what we love to see with Freddy is when he psychologically fucks with his victims. And you just wish you saw more of that with Freddy. Like you barely get a he's in the movie a lot, and this is probably the best Freddy since Dream Warriors in terms of that blend of horror and comedy. And it's really good because it's Robert Englund's swan song to the character, and you just kind of wish there was a little bit more of Freddy's kills in this. In some ways, it feels more like a Friday the 13th movie just because Jason seems to get more of the spotlight, despite Freddy being the one to incite the incidents that brings Jason back. So yeah,
I think if we count the Freddy slug, the CGI slug, and now he crawls into the pothead guy, does that count as a kill? Because
kind of like it.
doesn't the guy get ripped open?
Well, no, he crawls into him and possesses him, and then Jason slices the guy in half.
Okay, Jason kills him. Okay, I forget that part. But one thing I think Freddy vs. Jason has for me as a Goosebumps fan is all the Goosebumps alum that's in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep.
have Catherine Isabel. You have Brendan Fletcher. You have the guy who played Evan Ross from Monster Blood in this. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're a Goosebumps fan, you need to watch Freddy vs. Jason. Freddy vs. Jason is way higher on my list, as you'll see. I can't be too you know objective towards what you said there. You know, the treatment of Freddy in this movie. I hear the same complaint about Friday the 13th fans, saying that they don't like the treatment of Jason because they made him waterphobic. When has Jason ever been waterphobic? Stuff like that, right? And how they made Freddy kind of afraid of Jason when he's put in the dream realm with him. Like, Freddy's this big bad guy that can control dreams. What's so different about Jason? You know, um, I don't know. I get the complaints from both sides, but from somebody who just loves monster mashup movies, it's going to be way higher on my list. So I feel like I need to say what I'm going to say about that for later because I'm getting way ahead of myself. Now, my number 5. I guess in the middle is going to shock everybody. It's going to shock you. It's going to shock you. It might hurt you. It might hurt your feelings. I'm just going to pull the Band-Aid off now. It's the original Nightmare on Elm Street. All right, hear me out. This is where I think all these movies are good to great, like classics, like in my opinion. I love all these movies. However, the original movie, I've seen it so many times, and every time I watch it, I see more flaws in it. And I don't know if that's the same for every original slasher movie. I know a lot of people say this about the original Friday the 13th movie. They see more flaws in it every time they watch it, and it gets put down further and further in their list as time goes on. This is one of those scenarios for me. I'm not saying that this movie isn't instrumental and isn't important. It's a very iconic movie. I just don't think that it lives up to the highs of the other films I have left to talk about. I think the highs of the other movies feel more of why I love Freddy Krueger, and this one being the first. I do think that his makeup isn't the greatest in this movie. I do feel like some of the kill sequences are kind of choppy. I do the first kill of the movie, with the what's her name, Tina? Is that her name?
Yep.
Yeah, that was perfectly done. But then you get Johnny Depp's character in the movie where he gets sucked into a bed and you just see blood just sport all over the. While that's cool looking, it's it's not the coolest thing ever that you ever see Freddy do. In my opinion, I mean, you have the whole prison cell death. That's kind of cool in how it's done, but it's still not all that. Then you have the ending. I think the original movie has probably one of my least favorite endings of the whole franchise because you
Yeah.
go through this whole ordeal and then you get this weird sequence with Nancy getting into the car and it's Freddy, and then the mom gets a blow up doll. She turns into a blow up doll, gets sucked through the window.
Mhm.
I've never liked the ending to that original movie, but I do think the climax is kind of cool, even though it's nothing that you won't see in other movies done better. I think there are other movies that have better climaxes and better endings. Um, but this one being the first, I can appreciate a lot of technical aspects to it. I think it's well shot. I think the practical effects in this movie were great. And the way they had to shoot it in like a cube, they literally shot most of this movie in a rotating cube. That's super impressive, right? And the only other movies I've ever heard of being done like that was David Cronenberg's The Fly, where they had to build like a cube where they had Jeff Goldblum crawling around. That's hard to pull off, and they pulled this off with certain scenes, and not only like parts of the cube. They have one set here. They had to make like multiple in this rotating thing, and
Mhm.
that's just on a technical achievement basis. That's awesome. And listening to the behind the scenes and how they pull these stuff off is incredible. But as a
Mhm.
movie, in terms of story, I just like some other ones better. And I'm just being honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely can see that. I have a little bit higher on my list, and I'll get more into my thoughts on it when I get to there. But I definitely agree. Like the interesting thing about the first movie is Freddy makes the deaths look almost like the thing about the first movie. Freddy makes a lot of the deaths look like accidents or murders. Like with Tina, even though Rod obviously sees her getting dragged across the ceiling and stuff, in the end of things, it looks like Rod is the one who killed her because he leaves, it's her dead body on the bed, and that's the element of Freddy I kind of like is the idea of making the kills look like accidents. Rod hanging Rod in the jail cell just makes it look like Rod couldn't take it anymore and hung himself. But then, like the idea with Johnny Depp's death, how are you going to make that look like an accident? There's literally a giant blood geyser erupting from a hole in the middle of a bed. Like there's no denying there's some supernatural shit going on when there's something like that's happening.
And even part four, I think, try to homage that with a different style bed kill.
Mhm.
So I get the appeal of the first movie. I get the diehards. They all started their fandom here at this movie. I can totally see why people put this at number one as a de facto number one sometimes because they'll think can top the original. I just don't think that's the truth
Mhm.
here. I think there's
Yeah.
better movies in the original in this franchise. And I think the rest I have left to talk about, I think, are more revisitable movies for me. So,
Yep.
all right, so let's move on and let's go to what do we have? How many do we have left to talk about? I think there's 10
Four.
movies
So this
total,
is
right?
yeah, 9. So this is number 4.
Nine? Number four? Okay.
So the bottom of our top 4. So for me, that would be Nightmare 2: Freddy's Revenge. I I think this movie is severely underrated. I will admit, like, there's a lot of hate towards this movie that I don't think is really fair. A lot of people usually put this towards the bottom of the franchise, which I don't really get. While it is a weird movie, it's definitely a very bizarre movie, and there are some choices in here that don't aid the movie in any favors. It's often considered to be the gayest horror movie ever made, mainly due to Mark Patton, which you got to give credit to the guy because Mark Patton's great in this. But he was like there. This movie is responsible for kind of Mark Patton quitting acting because the story behind him is he was a closeted gay man at the time, and they kind of make a lot of suggestive and gay jokes throughout the movie and film it in a very homoerotic way that originally was meant to be subtext, but the filmmaking decisions just made it full blown into the forefront. And that kind of hurt. I don't know. It kind of effectively, yeah, again, make Mark Patton quit acting for a while. And, you know, there's a lot of cool stuff in this movie, though. I think the idea of Freddy trying to possess someone to kill to kill for him and give him back to strength is honestly a kind of cool idea. It is a little weird having it in the second movie because it kind of gives the whole fuck you to all the rules of the franchise, especially during the whole pool party scene, which is a cool scene, but it doesn't exactly follow the rules of the first movie where Freddy. Because why would Freddy want to come out into the real world? Because he's weak as shit when he comes out into the real world. But there's some great stuff in here. Again, Mark Patton and Kim Myers both do a really good job in the performances. This is probably Freddy at his darkest and scariest of the whole franchise. Like the way that he's just always in the shadows and has this is where they really give him that deep, demonic sounding voice. He has the red eyes, that like hook witch nose. Like it's just a really cool aesthetic and probably honestly might be my favorite version of the dark Freddys that we got in the earlier movies. And there's, of course, you gotta commend that amazing scene of Freddy ripping out of Jesse's body. Like those practical effects still hold up to this day, and they are phenomenal the way they did that scene. And like you gotta love this movie for what it has. It has its flaws, it has its weird moments, but it's just an enjoyable movie all around, in my opinion.
Yeah, my number 4 spot is part 2 as well. This movie, I definitely think, is the most serious tone movie next to the original movie. There's nothing really too comedic about this film unless we're talking about certain scenes like Jesse, dancing in his room,
Yeah.
doing that montage stuff. Or maybe I've seen some people kind of make fun of the bird scene or the flying bus scene at the end.
Yeah, or the coach's death. The coach's death scene. I mean, that seems fucking hilarious, though. That seems hilarious. Like,
it's hilarious, and there is some, for its time. There's a documentary. I think it was on Tubi. It was like the gayest horror movie ever made, and it had Mark Patton on there. He was talking about the movie and how the movie's kind of found its audience over the years, and like the LGBTQ community has kind of made it like a hallmark in gay horror, which is it's good to have that for them. I think it's perfectly fine if you want to recontextualize the movie into that. That's cool. I think it definitely has a place in today's climate, and I do think that people have come around on it more over the years. But as a movie on its own, I do like the concept of Freddy kind of trying to escape the dream world. But I don't feel like the movie presents enough reason as to why Freddy's doing this. Like maybe he can go into the realm of we can go into feed off the ending of the original where Nancy drags him to the real world and he's able to die. Well, maybe Freddy's like, well, I figured out a way that I can carry my powers into the real world, so now I want to come to the real world because I feel like I'm trapped here, and I can just live in the mortal world and get away with all this and maybe move on and then not be stuck in this eternal damnation. That would have made a little more sense. But for a concept like this, you need to really flesh it out, and the movie doesn't spend time fleshing it out. Like Mark Patton finds the glove in the boiler room. It's like calling to him and speaking to him, and it's kind of going this whole possession route. I think the possession angle is creepy as hell, where he's like wearing the glove and he's freaking out, and he's like, "Am I doing these kills or is Freddy doing it?" And it's kind of ambiguous. I really don't know if we actually know if his character is the one doing it or if it's Freddy possessing them. It's kind of implied that he's possessing him, but I think that's what adds to the freakish nature of it. And once Freddy comes out to the real world and he busts out of Mark Patton's body, that shit was scary as hell. Then he kills his best friend and goes on a murder spree. That's one of the most fun scenes of the whole franchise, where he's going on that murder spree and he's telling people, what does he say? Does he say, "Welcome to my nightmare," or he says something like that?
You all are my children now.
You're all my children now.
And of course, I kind of help yourself, fucker. When that one guy's like trying to negotiate with him.
the climax though is we're getting into that territory where the climax is super weird. Where
Hmm.
she's trying to convince Jesse to come out of Freddy, and Freddy's just laying there in the boiler tower, and he's just like freaking out because there's fire everywhere. He's like traumatized of fire. I'm like, where's this shit coming from? Like, the movie has some problems, but I think the kills are more fun here. I definitely think if we're talking Darker Freddy from like the first two, this is where Robert Englund I think really found that groove of Freddy originally.
Yeah.
And while I don't think that it really fits in the franchise, at least when we're talking about the original six movies. Like obviously one, three, four, five, and six are connected in some way, shape, or form. Two is kind of like that branch off where like you can consider it like maybe after the events of whatever movie here, or maybe it's its own multiverse. But I
Mm.
love it for being weird. I love it for being different and different feeling in the franchise, and that's probably why I have it here. I kind of floated with this and the original movie with that placement. I was like back and forth with this and one, but I put two above it because I like revisiting this movie a little more, and every time I watch it, I kind of appreciate it more.
Yeah.
So
And like the thing is, like one thing that's like interesting as well is like the question I always had is like, how is Jesse still alive after Freddy rips out of his body? Like Freddy comes out of his body, kills Grady, and then Jesse's standing there fully formed again while Freddy's laughing at him in the mirror.
yeah, that part I don't understand as well. Like it's one of those type of movies that has cool concepts in like a metaphorical sense, but if you're trying to like dismantle the logic, you're gonna hit a lot of hurdles. You're gonna be like, that doesn't make sense. It's definitely one of those type of movies, but it's a movie about dreamscapes and how dreams become reality, or your reality mirrors your dreams. I think the movie kind of went a little bit too heavy with that in some areas, but I
Yeah.
do think that it has some of the franchise high points, at least in terms of
Mhm.
comedy and like memorable kills. So it has its pluses and its negatives for sure.
Yeah. And like as well, like one other thing, we gotta address the thing. Kim Myers, she looks so much like a young Meryl Streep. Like it's not even funny.
Dude, I thought okay, I'm not even gonna bullshit y'all. When I first watched this movie, I was convinced that was Meryl Streep. And I told everybody for years. I'm like, oh yeah, did you know Meryl Streep was in Nightmare on Elm Street? And they're like, what fucking movie was she in? I say part two, and they say, no, that's Kim Myers. I'm like, you could have fooled fucking me. They look like
Uh,
I'm talking identical facial features. You could probably impose Meryl Streep at Kim Myers' age in that movie. They had the same nose, same mouth, almost the same eye structure. I was blown away by
yeah.
that. I had no idea.
Hmm.
All right, so now I think we're in the top three. We're in the top three.
Yep.
Let's
Yep.
go. Let's go. What's your number three?
So my number three is the original Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I get a lot of your criticisms with it, and I agree with a lot of them. I mainly rank this a little bit higher just because it'll always hold a special place in my heart because it is the movie that got me into horror. It's the movie that got me into this franchise, and it's become my favorite franchise. It's the first hardcore horror movie I ever watched. So there's just a lot of those kind of nostalgic feelings for me with this movie. It's the first kind of one of the first bigger movies my dad and I watched together, so that also kind of gives that sentimental value to it. And it's a classic. There's a reason it's a classic. It's the movie that gave us Freddy Krueger. It gave us Nancy, who's probably one of the best final girls in any horror movie ever made. Just like the way Heather Langenkamp plays her, and just that kind of fear in the beginning turned into this like warrior who wants to fight back and actually take Freddy out in the real world. Like that's such a fascinating and different take on a final girl than most final girls in horror, where they're just screaming and running away from the killer and not really doing much to actually aid in it, aside from maybe like Ginny in Friday Part 2. But like, Nancy is the first one to really have this urge to fight back against the killer and has this motivation to try to stop and figure out what's going on to stop both herself and her friends from dying. And I think that is just, such a unique aspect for a final girl in a movie. And Heather Langenkamp plays her so well. And just all of the other side characters, like Nancy's parents are both really well done. Kind of this estranged father who's, very strict and overprotective of his daughter and wants to kind of get to the bottom of this as a police officer. And of course, doesn't really believe anything she says about Freddie, versus her mom, who's just this ditzy drunk who's trying to basically drown out her sorrows and drown out everything going on. And that just, I don't know why, I just think that's very intriguing for them. While the side characters are very bland, and of course, this is the movie that gave us Johnny Depp. We wouldn't have Johnny Depp if it wasn't for this movie, because this is his first ever acting role. And, obviously knowing the megastar he is today, we probably wouldn't have him if it wasn't for this. And just, there's a lot of things that I just love. Like some of the most iconic kills and just practical effects in this movie with Tina's death. And just, I love the Johnny Depp kill. As much as it doesn't make sense, I still love it just for the visual. And there's just a lot of stuff that I really dig. This probably is my favorite soundtrack or score of the series as well. Like Charles Bernstein does such a good job with the score in this movie and really makes it adds that creepy atmosphere. And in my opinion, his score deserves to be up there with John Carpenter's Halloween score. It's phenomenal and so underrated in the horror genre. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you added the soundtrack because I do think the original film has probably one of the better soundtracks. I think my next movie has my favorite though. If I'm just being honest, but I like all the things that you added on the original movie. I can't really disagree with you. So I have nothing to add. But my next one, my number 3 is actually part 4. Part 4. I know. Part 4 is the Renny Harlin movie. Renny Harlin is known for action movies, and this movie kind of feels like the movie that came before it. Like it kind of feels like the R-rated Buffy the Vampire Slayer by Joss Whedon, like that original 1992 movie, but better. You have there are some things about it that you have to overlook, like the dog pissing on Freddy, because this takes place after part 3. In part 3, we see Freddy die, right, and we kind of understand where he's going to be at. Well, in part 4, they pick up where they put the body of Freddy, and he gets resurrected by dog piss. And then he starts going on a rampage, killing the Dream Warriors one by one, off in the first half of the movie. And the second half, we get the other characters, the carryovers, which at that point of the movie, that's when it becomes pure Renny Harlin, B movie schlock, but it's awesome as shit. It has easily the best climax, I think, of the whole franchise. That's the part 3. It's so much fucking fun. We see the acrobats and shit, acrobatics and the kung fu fight and shit. That shit is awesome. Okay. And the way Freddy dies in this movie is also pretty epic. The kills in this movie are rock. I love the shark glove on the island. That's one of the funniest shit ever. Him picking the heads off the meatballs, fun. This, of course, is the Bug movie where the girl breaks her arms in that gross ass fucking way. She turns into a cockroach. Holy fuck, that's one of the most metal things Nightmare on Elm Street ever did. This movie's just an absolute blast. It's just a fun, turn your brain off movie. It's not a movie where if you're a big Nancy fanboy or the part 3 fanboy, a lot of people have said it over the years they hate the first half of this movie because they love part 3 so much. I say that I think that given the circumstances of the things they had to deal with going into this movie, they still made a fantastic movie here. This is one of the 3 I like to watch the most. When I want to watch a Freddy movie, I put this one on and my next 2. I just think it's a fun time.
Yeah, and mine's a little bit higher up, so I'll get into that more when I talk about it. But that when you talk about that cockroach scene, talk about one of those injuries in the movie that you just see and you feel that. When her elbows break and the skin rips open, you just gotta you just wince when you see that. And it's again, it's one of those injuries you see and you just feel that. It's not, it doesn't necessarily look real. That's not what would actually look like if your elbows broke. But it's still just so ugh, it's I don't know how to describe it. It just like sends a shiver down my spine every time I see that part. And just like screaming Mad George with his practical effects during that transformation scene, they're so good and so like well done. And like just really play into that psychological fear of like just like imagine like in Debbie's case, like she's terrified of bugs. So like imagine having that psychological torment of turning into the very thing you're terrified of. Like
And that's what this movie kind of excels at. You've been talking about this. Freddy is still playing on the fears of his victims. He's not overly a cartoon yet, but he has that more comedic flair. If you want a perfect balance of cartoon Freddy and old school playing on your fears Freddy, this is it. Part 4 is that movie. It's that sweet balance of them. A lot of people say part 3 is where he starts to get more comedic, but I think part 3 he's probably at his most probably warped in terms of his humor. Like if we're calling part 3 a funny movie, I mean, holy shit, you guys must have some dark humor. No, but part 4, he's actually genuinely hilarious, and it's helped out by how over the top he is, and in the good way. And then you have these characters who are also over the top as fuck coming to fight him. It's just that B movie of the franchise that just I think has a cult following, and I think it's deserving. This is the movie that deserves a little more praise, and it's grown on me. Every time I watch this movie, I love it more and more. I used to not like it as much when I first watched these movies. It was kind of down there, but over the years, it's like grown tremendously for me because I started to see the charm in it and the appeal. And there's a lot of aspects to Freddy that I prefer in this movie over the rest of the franchise. And I'm being honest. So, all right.
right.
So
So
now we're at our top two, and
mhm.
I think I know what order you're going to go in because you have two movies left to talk about that I'm curious to see where you're going to put them. But what's your number two?
So this ranking will definitely be controversial to a lot of people because most people think this is the best movie of the franchise, and I think it's a fantastic movie. Honestly, my number two and my number one flip around constantly. I think they're both kind of tied at my favorites. I love them both equally, but in the end, you got to put one at number two and one at number one. And for me, my number two is Dream Warriors. I'm sorry, everyone out there who loves this movie dearly. And I love it dearly too, as I said this and the next one, which you can probably deduce which one is my number one. These are pretty much tied at my number one. I love part three. This is Freddy at his most entertaining, in my opinion. This and part four both are kind of where he's just at his most fun. You know, this is where Robert Englund really started to get to play around with the character and have fun with the role. You know, Freddie Spuna, all these iconic one-liners, you know, welcome to primetime bitch, being like just iconic. That's an iconic line. You know, this is where you start getting Freddy shape shifting. You know, you get those scenes of him turning into the massive snake or the marionette or the, TV. There's so many different forms Freddy takes in this movie and just make him so fun to watch. And this probably has some of the easily the best kills of the franchise. Like, part four has some fantastic kills, but the kills in part three are top notch, especially the marionette kill. The marionette kill is my favorite kill of the whole franchise. Just like the visualization and the psychological horror of that kill, of Freddy playing on Philip's ability to sleepwalk. You know, Philip sleepwalks, and Freddy knows this and plays on that by slicing open his arms and legs, pulling out his tendons, and walking him through this hospital hall like a marionette. But in the real world, it looks like he's sleepwalking, so everyone just writes it off. But like the psychological fear of this, basically being walked out to this upper balcony area of this mental ward, being dangled over the edge, and then being forced to jump to your own death is so scary, and like basically having no control over yourself. It's just horrifying to me in so many ways because like again, it's just that fear of loss of control, not being and having a pretty like it's a pretty brutal death too, like jumping to your death and falling onto pavement, like that's not a pretty way to go out. And like just the way they handle that scene is so well done with the practical effects of the tendons coming out of his arms and legs, And like that whole visual of Freddy like holding the puppet strings and then slicing them in the sky is super awesome. There's a lot of great stuff in that scene. The TV kill is also iconic. Freddy emerging from the TV, of course, giving the welcome to primetime bitch line and then smashing her head into the TV is great. The let's get high kill is another one of my top favorites. Because again, it's another one of those kills where Freddy plays with the character's weakness. With Taryn, who's an ex drug addict, he takes that and uses it against her in her death and kills her with a drug overdose. And like that, the visual of Freddy with the syringe fingers, I even have it on the back here, is just iconic. And like the whole effect of like the little trach marks on her arms, like becoming little mouths that Freddy injects the syringes into. Like it's just a great movie. Heather Langenkamp comes back as Nancy, which is awesome to see, kind of giving that official continuation from the first movie. All the Dream Warriors characters are great. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses that we can just relate to them as characters. You'll love to see them succeed, and you want to see them succeed over Freddy in this movie. It's one of the few movies in the franchise where you actually feel bad when you see these characters get killed because you get so attached to them. And you want to see them succeed. And like just everything they do, bringing back Donald Thompson and John Saxon coming in back in this movie is great. The way they kind of have an official send off to both him and Nancy, and the way they kind of both end up dying for the greater good of defeating Freddy. I think the mental ward setting is awesome. Just, Neil Gordon is a great addition to this franchise as well. The way he cares about these kids, and despite the fact that what they're saying may seem illogical, he's still willing to give them a chance and is still willing to learn about Freddy and fight back despite not being 100% sure at first if this is even real or not. And then once it is real to him, he's all in on protecting these kids and stopping Freddy, even at the sake of losing his job as well by prescribing Hypnosil. And just everything that happens in this movie is so well done. It's just a great movie overall.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think part three really signifies the legacy of the franchise. Like if you just had the first movie by itself, I think that would have been a fine standalone slasher of the '80s, right? And it would be up there with like The Burning or some of these other one-time, one-and-done slashers. But when you think about franchises, right? Everybody always talks about the greats, like Child's Play 2, Friday Part 4, Friday Part 6. Those are like big fan favorites there. People always talk about 1978 or Halloween 2. But for Nightmare on Elm Street, it's usually between 1 and 3. To me, I think 3 really cements what made the franchise popular. I think it's easily the most fleshed out of the movies in terms of characters. If you want good characters in a nightmare movie, part three is the movie for you. I think it's easily the best written. It's probably the best paced, the most experimental, and the most out there of the movies. Maybe next to part four. I'm not saying that part five doesn't get weird, but that's in the bad way. I think part three has a lot of swings and a lot of hits. Everything that it tries to do, it excels at. The soundtrack is good. The concept is probably one of my favorite concepts, where you get a band of misfits who don't really have much going for them in the reality realm. They get to be pretty much superheroes in the dream realm, and they get to fight off evil. They get to fight off a supervillain. This is like literally putting the Avengers against a big ultimate villain. I think if they wanted to remake A Nightmare on Elm Street, they should revisit this movie and try to make it that campy, but like dark as this movie
Mm-hmm.
got, and to make it like that fun '80s slasher. And I'm telling you, this would be a huge hit with modern audiences. This is to me what I think of when I think of A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is a little bit higher for me. Um, so as you can tell, I have another movie to talk about before I talk about this one because it's my number one. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with your points for sure. But my number two, you had it. I think you're number five. And listen, listen, listen. I know the controversy of me putting in this side, but in my opinion, when I want to watch A Nightmare on Elm Street, right? I'm often than not struggling with putting on part three, part four, and then this. It's Freddy versus Jason. Okay. Now I watched Freddy versus Jason when it came out in the theaters, right? I watched it with my dad. I have some nostalgia sentiment with it. I love the Goosebumps alum thing for it. I've revisited the movie at least a couple times a year for that reason. I think, but also why I love it so much is that it's one of the most fun modern slashers. Like at least from like 1996 to present day, in this post Scream era uh, versions of slashers, this movie's just outright fun, and it's like a part four for me. It's a turn your brain off movie. You go into it, you just enjoy the ride, and then get off at the end, and you're fine. If you're going in for story, if you're trying to compare both franchises, it's a mess. It's kind of lopsided. But Freddy, I think, returns to form, kind of like in that part three realm. I think the Freddy we get in Freddy versus Jason is very synonymous with part three Freddy. He's not overly comical. He's not a cartoon, but he's also really dark. But I think he strikes that balance that part four had too, where you get that blend a little bit, not too much. I think he's a little more darker here, but they do some things to him, like the whole Freddy slug. The CGI is fucking awful. Okay, y'all should go to hell for that. But Ronnie Yu, the director of this movie, made something really creepy here. And I do think that having a monster fight movie with two slasher icons was something that everybody wanted to see for years, ever since Jason Goes to Hell teased it. I mean, shoot, if you look at monster fight movies out in the history, you have what? Godzilla versus Kong, and then you have Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, maybe Frankenstein meets Dracula, or Wolfman meets Dracula. You don't see monster fight movies. And this is like possibly the biggest slasher fan's wet dream come to life. As a matter of fact, this movie was so popular when it came out, John Carpenter was willing to come back to Halloween just to make a Halloween fight between Michael Myers and Hellraiser and Pinhead, which I think probably would have been probably a bad move, but it would have been fun to see. Um,
Mhm.
but you already brought up some sound negatives with it. I mean, if we're talking to like story, it's not the greatest story ever. Freddy, if we're talking, if it's a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, Freddy has like one kill, maybe 1.5 kills here. Everything else, I mean, he's kind of treated like the butt of the joke, especially by the end. Mild spoiler: Freddy does not win. Freddy does not win, and I know that pissed a lot of people off. But hey, by the ending, it's implied that he's still immortal, and he can still live on. So I don't know. It's just one of those movies that should not work, and in a lot of ways it doesn't. But it just hits all those guilty pleasure buttons for me. That
Mm.
it's like it's endlessly revisitable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Freddy vs. Jason, yeah, I definitely agree. It's a fun movie, as you said. And like I think the standout kill in that movie is easily one where Jason kills that like asshole boyfriend in the bed.
With the
Like that
bed
scene
and he
is
folds it.
brutal. Like
Because
getting
that,
stabbed through the back like 50 times and then just folds the bed in half. Like
yeah, in opening sequence, you're like, okay, Jason's on the loose, and then we have the bed scene, which is kind of synonymous with Tina from the first movie. So that whole scene is about subverting expectations because you're like, okay, so where is Freddy going to come in? And then we get Jason again. Jason comes and folds him up again. You're like, oh shit, it's Jason. I was taken aback. I remember the first time I saw that, and I was like, okay, where's Freddy? And now, I think it has probably the dumbest setup to bring Freddy back as well in the movies, because literally, Freddy hasn't been talked about for years, and because he's mentioned one time in a hallway, that brings him back.
yeah.
Okay, I mean that's probably the most forced in thing I've seen in the franchise. But you have to look past the iffy to get to the good. So that's where I'm at with this one.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right, so now our number ones, and by process of elimination, your number one is part four.
Number 4. I I know there's a lot of people who have issues with this movie, but I adore this movie. It is just it's like Freddy vs. Jason. It's a shut your brain off and just have fun movie. And it's like the best example of that, in my opinion. You know, a lot of people rag on this movie for the characters and the writing and stuff. And it's like, yeah, sure, it has some rough characters, some rough writing. But for me personally, when I'm analyzing a piece of media a lot of the time, I look at it for the entertainment value because that's what in the end, movies and shows are entertainment. And so, in my eyes, while good writing and good acting and stuff, that's obviously an important factor. I more care about if it entertains me and if it's just a fun time, if I enjoyed it. And this movie gives me exactly that kind of experience for a lot of the reasons that you already brought up. It's just so fun to watch the way Freddy is full on comedy in this movie, but he is actually funny. And just, there's all these like kind of goofy scenes like Freddy putting on the sunglasses or like the shark fin Freddy and just like all these things like that that really in hindsight shouldn't work, but this movie makes it work so well. It's easily the most visually interesting as well. Like Rennie Harlan knows how to direct a movie, and just all these fun experimental camera angles and just colorful lighting and stuff just really make this movie a treat for the visuals alone. And again, it has some of the most iconic kills. Another one that really stands out to me is the asthma kill, where he kills Sheila in the classroom. Because like I have asthma, so that like scares me psychologically because like just the dying of an asthma attack is like, and while like the whole thing with like the wanna suck face where he like basically kisses her and sucks the life out of her is a bit weird. That whole scene is still really cool though. The effects of her like shriveling up and like turning into like this hollow out husk is really cool. And again, like it's another one of those things where Freddy makes the death look like an accident or something natural. Because Sheila has asthma, so this makes it look like an asthma attack. And the bug transformation scene is obviously, as we covered before, it's great. The effects are great. Really some of the most horrifying visuals of the franchise. I think as like as uncomfortable as the waterbed scene makes me feel, since I'm not like, despite being a horror fan, I'm not a huge fan of like nudity in movies. So like as like weird as that scene is for me, it's still like, let's be honest, that's the way Joey was meant to go out from the start. You know him in part 3. He's the horniest bastard you'll ever meet. And so like just being enticed by a naked woman in a waterbed and then Freddy jumping out and drowning him is like, it's the way he was meant to go. I'm sorry, but like it's just how it was meant to be. And like the whole junkyard scene is really fun. The visuals in that are great. This idea of Kincaid waking up in like the hood of a car and seeing Freddy getting, as dumb as it is, the dog pissing on the grave. The whole scene of like Freddy resurrecting is really cool. Almost gives like Hellraiser 1 vibes of like the bones coming together and the skin appearing back on. And like, that sequence is really well done. And Kincaid's just like sense of like, oh shit, this is all happening again, isn't it? And like the whole scene of him like thinking he gets the one up on Freddy when he crushes him by the car and celebrates too early. And like the guy who plays Kincaid, I can't remember his name, but like he is the most fun character of this whole franchise. Just like the energy he brings to this character is awesome, both in part 3 and in this. And just like the way he's just celebrating and after he crushes Freddy with the car is hilarious. And then like you get this whole ordeal of like he realizes he gets trapped in this giant maze where it zooms out and you see almost like this globe is this junkyard maze that he's trapped in. And while it is kind of sad seeing him go and very kind of killed off very unceremoniously by just getting a few stabs to the gut, like it's still a really cool scene. And I think, it is jarring. The one thing we got to address, the elephant in the room, Tuesday Night as Kristen is definitely a downgrade from Patricia Arquette. She's not as charismatic as Patricia Arquette is in the third movie, but I still think she does a good job with the role. And it's kind of dumb but funny as well that she is basically killed by her idiot of a mother because her mother's slipping her the sleeping pills and just like you hate this woman so much because of how she treats Kristen in both movies and just how neglectful of a parent she is. And there's that. And like the one negative I will have in this movie, like the other things I pointed out, while they're kind of more criticisms other people have, I still find enjoyment out of them. The one negative is that stupid fucking karate kill.
Oh yeah.
With the invisible Freddy. It's so dumb, so cartoony, and like you can tell they ran out of budget in this scene. Like it's very synonymous behind the scenes. They had a bigger scene planned with the elevator, which you get a little bit of in that scene, where Rick was originally going to die with the elevator falling apart, and he was going to like fall into some kind of void. But they ran out of budget, and they had to do this karate kill, which is dumb. You couldn't even get Freddy. You just had him kicking air with some cartoon sound effects of like punching sounds and Freddy like laughing, and then all you get is the glove flying at him and stabbing him through the torso. And even then, like if you pause that shot where the glove goes through his torso, the glove is facing the wrong way. Like the blades are facing his back instead of facing out towards the camera. And like that's the only scene I will like say is bad. Everything else I adore with this movie. It's just a blast from beginning to end. Freddy's death is easily the most cool visual, and like just the way they pulled that scene off with all of these souls pressing out of Freddy's skin. And just the behind the scenes of that is really cool, where they built this giant Freddy torso that they had all these actors pressing up against, is really sweet. And then this like animatronics, the Freddy head where they rip his jaw open. Like it's just it's a brutal death for Freddy, and it's really awesome. And I love Alice as a final girl, as I mentioned. She's her growth in this movie, going from this very shy, quiet, timid girl who can't really socialize, doesn't really have much confidence in herself. And as the movie goes on and she absorbs her friends' dream powers basically and their personalities, she gains more confidence and starts becoming another very badass heroine, kind of like Nancy was in the original movie. Which I just love it. I love this movie for every reason I said.
I mean, yeah, to add on to the karate kill, if I'm being honest, that's probably my least favorite kill of the whole franchise. If only because it's probably the most lazy.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some pretty bad ones in there, especially in part six. And then you have, the stupid one in part five. But this one is my least favorite. That's probably the only moment in the whole movie where I just legitimately don't like what I'm watching. But everything else, I think you're spot on. You're spot on with this movie. That's why it's in my top three. Like I literally struggle with my top three because I love them all almost equally, but for different ways. Different ways. So like part four, I love it because it's a Rennie Harlan movie. It's probably the most fun of the original six. It's just batshit. It's like textbook icon Freddy next to like part three, but this one is like more comedy focused and it's easily the funniest movie. So I love it for that. And it's also over the top. I love Freddy versus Jason for being that twang of modern slasher. I love it for having this dark, gritty, monster fight flair to it. I like that it's a monster mashup, and then you get these over the top things about it too that really bring some charm to it. But then you have my number one, which is part three for this franchise. And I could easily go any way with my top three. It depends on what day you get me. But if I'm talking like the best of this franchise, I think part three is probably the best movie. And I've already kind of touched base on it. Best characters, best character development. This is Nancy's send off in the original timeline. So it has that emotional weight to it. You care about all these characters. I think Freddy, he's starting to have humor, but it's more of a dark humor one. It's not so
Hmm.
like unintentionally funny as part two, where part two you can laugh because Freddy's trying to be dark, but it's the kills themselves sometimes can be so absurd it's kind of funny. Well, in this movie, what Freddy's doing is diabolical. I mean, like, welcome to prime time, bitch, and he's shoving the girl into the TV. That's brutal as shit. Him putting puppet strings in a guy's arm, that's brutal as shit. Making him walk off and commit suicide. What the fuck, Freddy? I mean, some of the shit that he does in this, he takes heroin needles and stabs an addict in the stomach with it. What the fuck? Like, I think the most goofy part about part three is the wizard scene. Even the
Yep.
wizard scene is kind of cool, but it's still goofy as hell. But yeah, I mean, the final act is so emotional, it's so riveting. It's probably one of my favorite final acts of the whole movie. This is where we start to get more of the backstory of Freddy, and it doesn't go too far with it. And I think this set the template of what I think the creators have said in the past. They really did want to have a new trilogy set up to follow this, but they hit an immediate snag trying to write four. because they couldn't get the people to stay on. So they had to like pivot almost immediately, and that's how part four got jumbled up the way it did. But this, like, if we're talking like the first six movies, is textbook Nightmare on Elm Street. It's that perfect. I think it's that perfect Freddy for me, where he's a little dark and mind gamey. He's manipulative. He has that sinister aspect to him. He has that mystique that's not quite ruined. He's not quite overboard in the humor. He's a threat and a menace, like he should be. But I do think that it has a lot more heart and soul with the characters, and having Nancy get sent it off in this way, I thought was cool. And then I think Patricia Arquette, her role was really good. And honestly, the guy who played Kincaid, he deserves all the accolades. I mean, every scene this guy is in this movie, he eats it. He is fun as hell. He's shouting his full ass off, punching through walls like he's fucking Ben Grimm or Bruce Banner. I mean, this shit is fucking awesome. I mean, these characters, one of the most beloved of this franchise, and this is the movie that made him that icon status. And yeah, I have a huge soft spot for this film. That's why it's like my number one. I think it's going to be my permanent number one because I can't quite, even though I love part four and I love Freddy vs. Jason as like those turn your brain off fun as shit movies. I just think part three is a better quality movie than those.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I have it here. But like I said, they can interchange it. You just have to catch me on a certain day.
Yeah. And like I think parts 3 and 4 are easily the best in terms of Freddy's makeup as well. Like Freddy's makeup is phenomenal in both of those movies. Like that's really like the definitive Freddy Krueger look is in those two.
Oh yeah, and like part four, he looks the part. Like part three and part four, like those are the posters that you want for your horror room, kind of Freddy. Because Robert Englund, I think they mastered the makeup at that point. I think part two, he kind of looked too much like he was skinned a little bit. Part one, he kind of looked choppy. Part six, we already talked about that. I don't know what the hell they were trying to go for there. Part five, didn't look that bad. But that sweet spot of that Freddy makeup's here. And I think part three, the soundtrack in this movie is awesome too. Dream Boy,
Yeah.
you know that song? Holy
yeah.
Every time that song comes on, I got to jam out when I'm watching this movie.
Oh yeah, I have that in my Apple Music playlist. Like I love that song.
Even though I think part four has my favorite soundtrack. There's so much classic '80s music and it's all good. But part three is probably my second favorite, next to the original in terms of sound score. I also think that part three it has probably one of the more scarier settings of the franchise.
Yeah.
Like it being set in a mental asylum. There's something about that that's just really creepy. It has that Hellraiser 2 vibe. Like when you watch Hellraiser 2, part of what makes that movie kind of fucked up is that the fact that the whole movie takes place in an asylum. This movie, you have that same effect here, where you're dealing with like people that are like not conventional characters that you'll normally see in the franchise or any other slasher franchise, where they're just horny teenagers. These aren't horny teenagers. They're like people with like fucked up baggage, like put into
aside from Joey. Aside from
Joey, okay, but but most of them have like some sympathy and like some real world problems that make them like more fleshed out than your average Nightmare on Elm Street character. And you just gotta I just love this movie for it taking more bolder swings. So
yeah, and I feel like the psych ward setting also makes the character situation feel more hopeless because like when you're in a insane asylum, who's gonna believe you when you say this dream killer is coming after me and I'm gonna die if I fall asleep? Like they already kind of did that in the other movies too, but like this one especially, all of the doctors just write them off as they're crazy. And like Dr. Sims, especially, like this woman's a bitch in this whole movie. And like the fact that she is like her main source to stop these kids who are afraid of falling asleep, afraid of dying, just sedate them. Just sedate them. That'll be the answer to the problem, right?
And then like Nancy has to convince the skeptic guy that all this is real. And I thought that part of the movie kind of provided some legitimacy as well, because for the first time you get to see somebody who's like a trained professional in like sleep therapy and psychology and all that being a skeptic to this phenomenon, and we get to see an outside looking in perspective of a character coming into this phenomenon and being like, yeah, are you sure this shit is real? And the characters have to, of course, convince them that it's real. But I thought that was a really intriguing angle they took there too. Um, so yeah, like in terms of writing, I think easily this is probably one of the better written, if not the best written, of the films.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's our franchise ranking of A Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm sure we probably pissed a lot of people off with some placements we put on here, but I'm sure I probably pissed lot more of you off than he did. But uh, to be fair,
I mean, me putting New Nightmare at the bottom probably pissed a bunch of people off.
be putting Freddy versus Jason way over the original probably pissed a lot of people off. But
Mhm.
I'm just speaking on how I feel, and I know Micah is as well. Um, please go sub up Ultimate Goosebumps, man. I'm gonna put his channel information in the descriptor of this video. Go check out his podcast. He's a part of this Goosebumps Crew podcast. I also guest star as Goosebumps Completionist every once in a while on there. He's also a fellow Goose Junkies podcast member. If you're not subscribed to our my Goosebumps Completionist channel, we do host Goose Junkies on there. So feel free to check out all of our other stuff that we have going on. Thank you all for watching. And until next time, I hope to see you in another collab, Micah. Maybe we can do another slasher
Yeah, of
franchise
course.
down the road. This was super fun. And I hope you all take care out there watching. Peace.
See ya.